Hey everybody, so today I'm going to be reviewing The Well of Ascensions by Brandon Sanderson. So before I get into my review, let me just say that the first portion of this review is going to be spoiler free, so if you haven't read this book, that is totally okay, I'm not going to spoil anything, and then the second part of the review is going to be spoiler filled, so I'm going to talk about all the actual specifics of what happens in the book. Just to start off, coming off of the first Mistborn book, I had some pretty high expectations for this book just because I felt like the first Mistborn book, the last third of it, was just so impressive. It was so outstanding. I just so thoroughly enjoyed it that I had such high expectations for the second book in the series. And let me just say right away, it did not disappoint. And one of the things that I would like to point out about this book is that I feel like it was much more evenly spaced out when it came to like interesting plot development. So like the first book, I felt like it maybe was a little bit slower toward maybe the first two-thirds of the book, still good, but a little bit slower. And then the last third, incredible. I felt like in this book you felt that more spread out throughout the whole book, where maybe it didn't have this like beautiful crescendo at the end in the last third, but the whole book was really good and it kept you engaged the entire time. So that was definitely a plus for this book for me. The next thing that I would have to say is a bit of a pro and also kind of a con for the book is that so the way Brandon Sanderson writes his characters is incredibly realistic. I feel like he has some of the most realistic fleshed out characters of any author in the game. And there's some benefits of that as you get these incredibly dynamic characters that you love to follow. But another part of that is that you have characters, maybe when they're dealing with something, you have them mulling that over in their head consciously or constantly, repeatedly, over and over and over again. They're thinking about a certain thing. And while that is realistic and that is definitely what someone who had maybe gone through a certain scenario would be doing, it's not always the most enjoyable to read just because it's a little repetitive at times. You're like, okay, okay, I get it. You're thinking about this thing, but I don't need to hear about it every single time. Overall, I would still say that Brandon Sanderson's character work is definitely a pro. He is so good at developing characters, and that's a tiny little nitpick. Just some parts are a little bit repetitive, but it's a very small nitpick in what I feel like are some incredibly dynamic characters, and not just the main characters. I feel like even the side characters in this book are very well done. They have depth to them, not like side characters. Side characters so often just kind of fall into these little kind of trope cliche-ish where they just basically have like one character trait and that defines them entirely. Brandon Sanderson does not do that. He has incredibly developed side characters, and I think that is a huge benefit for the first Mistborn book as well as this one. The other thing that I really enjoyed is that, so for the first Mistborn book, one of my critiques was that I thought that the dialogue was a little cringy at times. Just some of the one-liners that were delivered, I thought that they were a little cheesy. In this book, I did not feel that whatsoever. I thought that the dialogue was very well written throughout. I thought that Brandon Sanderson, I mean, and it makes sense as he became more developed as an author. He got better at writing dialogue. So I thought that the dialogue was really good in this book. Definitely a pro. So that's about all I have to say in terms of spoiler free. I would definitely recommend this series to anybody looking to kind of get introduced into fantasy. That is the biggest thing with the first Mistborn book, is I felt like it was a great introduction to fantasy, and I feel like the second book carries on that legacy. It really just builds off of everything that the first book established in such an incredible way. I thoroughly enjoyed this book and would highly recommend this series to anybody looking to enter into fantasy. So that concludes the spoiler-free section of this video. So if you haven't read the book, don't go any further because I'm about to spoil everything. The first thing that I gotta mention about this book is that I love the fact that we got to deal with kind of picking up the pieces of what was left after killing the Lord Ruler, because so often I feel like in books they beat the big bad guy and then that's kind of where the story ends. We don't deal with the ramifications of what happens to like this society that has been destroyed by this horrible person. And in this book we got that. We got to kind of deal with the aftermath, and I really enjoyed that. The other thing that I loved about this book was that we kind of had the presence of Kelsier throughout the book, because he was my favorite character in the first book, and obviously he wasn't going to be in the second book, but I love that he was talked about so frequently, and I felt like that was more realistic. You would have someone that's so influential, but kind of in books often you'll have that character kind of be forgotten after they die and people don't really talk about them. But in this book we felt Kelsier's influence on the story the entire time. People are constantly thinking, you'll have people just thinking to themselves like about, oh, what would Kelsier have done? And I really enjoyed that. When it comes to specific characters, I think that Vin is a really good protagonist. I love the fact that she's so kind of dynamic, of her dealing with the PTSD of everything that she's been through. I love that. I feel like it's such a realistic depiction of someone dealing with PTSD. And the part that I was talking about in the spoiler free section about where it felt like it was a little bit repetitive was her kind of thinking about what Ellen thinks about her, like, oh, he probably doesn't love me, oh, does he love me, and this. And I feel like that is realistic. That is probably what someone in her situation would constantly be thinking about. but it got a little repetitive at times. I'm just like, all right, he likes you or he doesn't like you. Let's think about what's happening with this with the mists. Let's worry about that. Obviously, that's a minor critique, though. Overall, I thought that Vin is an incredibly fleshed out character. Next, I gotta talk about Elend, and obviously, you have this trope in so many stories of this like guy that does everything good, and he's just totally a good person, the greatest guy in the world. Everything he does is good, and sometimes that's a little bit boring. But I feel like this book it does a little bit better because you have Elend where he's good to a fault at some point, and you kind of saw that when he was voted out by the kind of the parliament that he had set up, because everyone, they had voted and they're like, well, can I change my vote? And it looked like he was going to be king because they'd reached a stalemate, but then someone asked, can I change my vote? And he wrote the rules, so he could have been like, no, but he knew that it was part of the rules that he had written that you could change your vote, and so he let them change the vote, and he ended up losing his kingship for it. I enjoyed that. I like the fact that he was good to a fault, because if he always made the right decision and everything always works out well for him, it's a little bit boring. Obviously, everything still did kind of work out well for him, but it was a little bit more interesting that we saw some of the detriments that come from being such a great person. And then I like the fact that he becomes a Mistborn. I think that that'll be really interesting in the third book. The coolest character in this book would have to be Zane, though. I mean, Zane had the greatest introduction to it was just kill him, whispered God. That was his first chapter. That's such a cool way to start your kind of character, our introduction to Zane. And throughout, I felt like he was a really, really cool character. I'm almost a little bit sad that he died. It was done in a really nice way, but I almost wanted to see more of him just because he was so interesting. The way he like interacted with his father, the way he interacted with Vin, he was just so mentally unstable and unhinged. It was really cool following him along. And obviously, he had the whispering, and I'm interested to see if that we're gonna find out if that whispering had to do with the Well of Ascensions or if that was just him being kind of crazy. I'm not sure entirely. I think it might have just been him being crazy, but they maybe kind of alluded to it was more than that. So it'll be interesting to see that in the third book. Another thing that I really enjoyed is that Brandon Sanderson depicted the final battle in a bit of a more realistic way, in my opinion, because you had main characters actually die. Doxson, Clubs, they both died in the final battle. I really enjoyed that. Obviously, it was sad, but it was really, really kind of realistic. You have this big battle at the end, and so often, I keep talking about what happens so often and how Brandon Sanderson kind of doesn't do that, but I really enjoy that about his writing. And you had actual losses in the big battle at the end, and Clubs' loss was so sad. He was wearing the disc at the end, and the same with Doxson. I actually really enjoyed Doxson as a character. I honestly kind of thought that he was the Conjura the whole time. I really thought it might have been Doxson, but then when I found out it wasn't Doxson, I'm like, oh no, Doxson. But then getting into that, you had kind of the biggest twist of the entire book, because the whole book you have Vin developing this relationship with Orsur. I think that was his name. And then you have this, like, obviously, she doesn't like him, which I did not like at first, that she was so mean to him. But then you kind of figured out her reasoning why, and I still didn't like that she didn't like him. But then she started being nicer to him, and it actually felt like they were developing this really strong bond. And then the biggest twist is he's been working for Zane the whole time, and I was like, oh. That was a really, really interesting part. I know that was one of the more interesting character relationships in the entire book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading about those two. The other intriguing part of the story is obviously Sazed, I think it's Sazed. The other really intriguing part of the story is Sazed kind of dealing with kind of trying to put together stuff from the logbook and stuff from like the steel tablet that he had found and trying to translate that, just him putting that together and seeing so many contradictions. I remember reading like the little excerpts at the beginning of every chapter and being like, it feels like there's contradictions here, and sure enough there were, and that was kind of really cool, playing off of, it felt like a little bit it was dealing with sometimes the unreliable nature of old documents and how they will sometimes like contradict each other, but also you just had this like outside force that was influencing these documents and trying to push someone going towards the Well of Ascension. I thought that was really interesting, and it was a great setup for the third book. I'm so excited to pick up the third book. Overall, though, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I still think that the first book was better. We'll see. Maybe after a reread, I might change my opinion, but I still think that the first book was better. Overall, though, both books were incredible. Well of Ascensions was a phenomenal sequel to the first Mistborn book. I can't wait to pick up the third one. Anyway, if you disagreed with anything I said in this review, make sure to comment down below. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great day.